Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Canada Today with another episode with another amazing guest today in our studio. We have a friend, an activist, a leader who has been doing amazing things in the community for quite some time, and there is an accomplishment that, of course, we are here to highlight and of course celebrate. Today, we are going to be talking about talking to an individual who is, mashallah, well known in the community, and I'm going to be actually, I'm going to be introducing to you in just a moment. Um, One of the things to underline and realize, of course, this past 1 year has been quite heavy for entire community, entire world. Of course, the pandemic itself has been so challenging. On top of that, unfortunately, we have had some horrific headlines from south of the border and in Canada involving police brutality, unjust killings, unfortunately. And right in our, in our own backyard, we have had issues of this sort. We have our own share, such as the killing of Ijaz Chaudhry in Malton, Ontario, in Malton, Canada, Mississauga, Ontario, and of course the killing of somebody who was right outside the masjid, a volunteer, Muhammad Aslim Zafis, for instance. So unfortunately, given all of this, these circumstances, they have been a great level of insecurity in the Canadian Muslim community. Alhamdulillah, in the midst of all of this, we have heard a good news of an individual by the name of Ahmad Attia, who is our special guest today, who has been recently appointed as chair to the Regional Municipality of Peel Police Services Board by the Regional Council of Peel. Ahmad is a businessman and entrepreneur who has dedicated his life professionally and personally through volunteerism to advancing community and social causes. With over 15 years of experience, Ahmad currently serves as the CEO of Incisive Strategy, where he has demonstrated deep expertise in crisis management, public affairs, and risk management. And Ahmad is a respected community advocate and human rights activist in Canada and internationally. He currently serves on the board of Muslim Council of Peel. Through his volunteer work, he dedicates his time to supporting youth, youth mentorship, relief work, civic engagement, and community projects. So mashallah, he wears lots of hats, and this is why we are here to talk to him about some interesting, talk about some very interesting themes that not many people are necessarily able to talk about, given his wonderful positioning in the community. So Ahmad, first of all, welcome to Canada Today, and thank you for being here this afternoon.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Same here. Thank you. It's our pleasure. Well, on just past Friday, you tweeted that you joined the Human Rights Watch Canada's International Justice Circle. That's a great news, and congratulations on yet another appointment. You clearly worked, you have clearly demonstrated, mashallah, why you should be there in such circles and positions. Now, tell us, what does that mean for not just the community, but for the kind of work that you are passionate about? Why is it, why is it, I guess, critical and significant for you?
Well, thank you, Taha, and thank you for opening with that question. I was very humbled to be invited and appointed to Human Rights Watch's International Justice Circle. Human Rights Watch does very important work around the world in its research and in its efforts to expose human rights violations. And I myself, for a number of years, have been doing a lot of human rights work in collaboration with HRW. And so, it was quite an honor to be among individuals and leaders in Canada who sit in the circle. The circle itself supports Human Rights Watch's work on bringing accountability to those who have committed gross human rights violations or war crimes anywhere around the world and should be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. And so it's a very important piece of work that needs to be done around accountability. And while there isn't a kind of direct connection between that work with Human Rights Watch and my role in the region as the chair of the police board, it certainly does give, a perspective or a reflection as to where my passion is, where my heart is. I've centered my firm Incisive Strategy around human rights work, and it very much informs my viewpoint and perspective and my voice that I bring to my work, but also my role as a member of the PO Police Board.
That's amazing. So tell us a little bit about your background, how you got started with just community engagement, community development work, and then a lot of political engagement work, and then of course the human rights work that you do and around justice and human rights efforts that you've been engaged in more recently. So tell us about your journey, and I know we can probably do an entire show on that, but love to hear how you all began and maybe draw some inspiration for myself and others.
Absolutely. Growing up, I've always, had, done my share in going out to a local protest or with the community on various human rights issues or community issues. But I wouldn't necessarily, growing up, have called myself someone who was very informed or active in the human rights and social justice space. I spent a lot of my younger years doing youth work and and other community type of programming. But my exposure really to human rights started with my own personal ordeal. As you probably know, Taha, a friend of yours, a family member of mine, Khalid Qazzaz, who was detained in Egypt. My brother-in-law and my family and our friends and yourself and a lot of the community campaigned for his freedom for about 3 years until he was reunited with his wife and children back here in Canada. It was that experience really that woke me up and exposed me to not only the injustices around the world but also the amazing people who have committed their lives to and their voice to those who are actually silenced by oppression and by oppressors. And so that opened my eyes up, and I decided to commit a significant part of my life to social justice and human rights and political engagement as well. And I actually believe that it's very important that our community be politically engaged, because through my experiences, I've discovered that we can have a voice and we can speak out on issues, but ultimately action and decisions are taken by governments and elected officials, and these same governments and elected officials actually affect our lives, and their decisions affect affect and impact our lives every single day in ways that we're even unaware about. And so when we look at the success of human rights issues, many that Taha, you yourself led, the recent motion on the Uyghur Muslims and it being genocide, and the Canada taking a stance on Burma as well, determining that it's genocide. These are all an outcome of engagement and awareness and education of political decision makers to come to those outcomes that are very important in human rights advocacy. And so political engagement, human rights, social justice, they're all interconnected. Myself, I've become, over the years through my firm, more specialized in crisis management and crisis response. And in that, I often work on human rights issues.
Amazing. What an interesting journey, subhanAllah. Now, you said that recently you were quoted in insaga.com. I've firsthand witnessed across the world situations where law enforcement and justice systems are not set up to protect civilians. So, I see what you're talking about, of course, now that you already just mentioned your own sort of personal family crisis that led you to this. Excuse me. I wonder. It's interesting, actually. Let me just say this as a reflection. Almost every time I talk to an accomplished person like you, I see an interesting pattern, and that is that most people, despite the fact that they were doing some great work before in their lives and they had great vision, but in most cases where they are today, it seems like sometimes almost accidental. So I wonder if this experience was not there, had you not experienced this personal, crisis and tragedy involving your brother-in-law, do you think you would be here today serving on the board of Peel Police, Regional Police, or any of these just human rights and justice spaces that you're in right now?
Well, I mean, who knows? That for sure, that ordeal has very much influenced or impacted my life, my family's life, who I've become. And so, if that hadn't happened, I'm not sure where I would have been today, or whether I'd be on the same path. Probably not. But after taking kind of that path, it's really opened my eyes up to what you've talked about, what I commented with with insaga.com, and what I often speak about with media. Taha, I've worked on cases around the world, and many Canadians are very, unaware of these, of the atrocities that happen around the world. We hear about major kind of crisis like Burma, like the Uyghur, but there are people around the world every day who just in their basic lives, day to day, are live in fear. Right, live in fear from kind of the regimes that they are, live under. And I've witnessed through cases that I've worked on, Taha, and my firm's worked on. We work on cases of Canadians or others, innocent people who are arbitrarily detained, right, detained without cause. People who are kidnapped by police, people who are arrested without an arrest warrant. Very simple rights that we have. People who are interrogated and tortured. People who are, police come into their homes and search their homes without a search warrant. People who are held incommunicado. People who are detained without trial. People who go to trial and those trials are unfair. And the list goes on. And when you witness that, you realize how blessed we are to have either been born or, immigrated to Canada and become Canadian citizens. And even though we have many areas that we need to improve on, we certainly have a justice system that is established or created and functions, as well as a police system, to protect people and not to persecute them. And our community knows firsthand cases of people who, Canadians like Yasser Bez recently, or Tariq Lubani, John Grayson. These are cases in Egypt who went to Egypt and were persecuted by Egyptian police and detained for months without charge or trial. No evidence ever brought forward against them. Fabricated allegations were created to justify their detention. We know the case of Hussein Salil, a Canadian who was kidnapped by Pakistan and handed over to China, and then tortured and forced to sign confessions that were used to sentence him to life. We know the case of a Canadian citizen, Salim Al-Aradi, in the United Arab Emirates, who was kidnapped by police and then put into secret torture prisons, underground secret torture prisons, and then based on false allegations, false evidence, fake witnesses in the court system, he was, there was an attempted trial. Eventually, he was released and reunited with his family in Canada. And so, even cases, there are stories that are very close to home for us. It isn't, you don't have to really look far to see how blessed we are in Canada that these things don't generally happen to us, and they certainly reinforce for me that we should not take it for granted that we have a good system, and we should make sure that we're always working to improve those systems to serve Canadians and to protect the the constitutional rights that we have as Canadians.
Great, thank you. I mean, you're so right. So many basic human rights we take for granted here in Canada. Now let's talk about your appointment not that long ago, of course, as the chair of the Peel Regional Police. Let me first ask you, what was the reaction of the community, and what was the reaction from the wider community when you were elected? And connected to that, I wanted to ask you a question about, based on what you experienced, what does that tell you about representation and why people of color in general, are perhaps missing, and when people like you achieve such a milestone, why is it such a big deal?
Absolutely. I mean, the community has been very excited. People have been, very, very generous in expressing their excitement with me. I have, people who I look up to have acknowledged this opportunity that's been given to me. And a lot of people have called me with advice, that I should consider as a chair. And a lot of youth have called me to actually discuss controversial issues around the police. And other youth have called me to ask me, how can I become a police officer? This is amazing. And so I've been getting all kinds of feedback from the community, also beyond the community. I think generally within PO, people have become very excited. I think it's the first time, and I'm very humbled by this, to be honest, but it's the first time the media has actually picked up on the who the chair of the PO Police Board is. And I think a part of that is maybe my profile, and a part of that is the fact that I'm Muslim, and that's new. I don't think, and when I applied to be on the PO Police Board as a member, me being Muslim was never something I saw as a factor or a qualification for me to be on the board. It was never relevant in my mind. It was more about my perspective and thoughts that I brought to the table. But I do believe that, especially within PO, whether it's police or the municipal council, any top leadership must reflect the communities that we have here in PO, the people who choose to make PO their home. And it's not so much what community we come from, or what faith we have, or what color we are, what race we come from, but it's more about having people who have an intimate connection to particular communities, not all communities, but some at least, that gives them the ability to have a real sense of the pulse of the community, a real sense of the feelings of the community. And those are then, taken into consideration as we make decisions. As long as we have people in these positions that are there for the titles, there will never really be a real change. And so we're very lucky actually to have people like Mayor Bonnie Crombie and Mayor Patrick Brown, the two mayors of Peel, who have over the years developed a real connection to our communities and have an ear to the ground and listen to the residents of Peel. I'll just say that, having said all that, the Muslim community in Peel actually is significant. It represents about 10% of the population of the residents. And so our community plays a very important role in the contribution towards the region. And so in that sense, it is important that the police board and other boards or government entities do have someone from the Muslim community. As it relates to the police itself, I think it's crucial that the police membership, the police officers, are diverse and reflective of our communities, so that when an officer responds to the call and goes to someone's door, when they meet that person, if that person, for example, is Arab, or that person comes from the Pakistani community, they may speak Arabic or Urdu or other languages and may be less fluent in English. And those language barriers, if our officers are not diverse, those language barriers become a problem in how well we can effectively police and respond and keep our community safe. Because what I've come to learn as a police board member, the number one tool that should be used when it comes to policing is communication. And once there's a communication breakdown, then that's when unfortunate incidents happen. And I think that applies at all levels, not just police officers, but the board. And communication is key. And so you have to have a connection to communities, and you have to be willing to listen to the communities that we're mandated to serve.
That's amazing. I mean, I'm happy to hear that there's so many young youth, probably youth of color or young Muslims, and probably others who are inspired by your new appointment and are getting and seeking advice. This is really what it should be about. At the end of the day, is to inspire people to actually pursue their own goals in areas that they never thought of and our community never thought of. So this is a great accomplishment. So thank you for being that role model where in spaces and places where we often don't find people like yourself. Now, you spoke about issues, of course, related to policing and in general issue of the critical need for representation in boards and in public boards, essentially. Now, I wanted to talk to you about a couple of things related to, of course, policing itself. And you alluded to some of that already. But as we know, last summer, Black Lives Movement highlighted some very serious systemic injustices within policing, as well as, of course, other public bodies out there and among policymakers as well. And you recently, in October, you tweeted back in October, a joint commitment was needed to eliminate systemic racism in policing and promote transparency and accountability. So my question to you, and I'm sure you get asked this question all the time, as a chair of the board of a significant policing department or unit in Canada, and specifically, of course, Peel Region, what kinds of transparency and accountability are you talking about here? What in your role as a chair are you able to do and maybe not able to do? Because I think that's also important for us to discuss and talk about. I'm sure there's at times unrealistic expectations of roles that may not be true. So I want to hear from you. What is it that you think in your new role now you would be able to do and address, since you have talked about it a couple of times?
Absolutely. This is a very important question, and it's really at the heart and the core of kind of our priority, my priority, the board's priority when it comes to Peel Police. And I think, what you talked about, Black Lives Matter and the protests, and the board really does respect the desire and the right that residents of Peel have to protest peacefully and express their voice and their frustration. And I'll tell you, as a board member, and I know this applies to my colleagues, we certainly are listening. And, time and time again, we've seen devastating consequences from policing, because of the policing approach, whether it be something related to systemic racism or mental health or other issues. And so ultimately, the message we're hearing, and I'm hearing, is that policing needs to change. And when it comes to transparency and accountability, I think for me, ultimately, it's a question of trust. And the work that we need to do to rebuild the trust with our communities. And this is certainly front and center for the board. The board is directing a change from kind of traditional policing to one that's driven around community safety and well-being. And what that means is that we want to make sure that the Peel Police is serving all 1.4 million residents, million Peel residents equitably and fairly. That everything that we do in our policing approach is focused on ensuring their safety and their well-being. And so we're taking strides towards building that trust through engagement, through making sure that our policing approach is informed by the communities that live in the region. And it's happening at many different levels. I'll tell you, like recently, I attended a training session for Peel officers that they have to go through. And the session, the trainers were demonstrating to us how the training mindset has shifted because of the feedback of the community, and how police officers are now being trained to think about de-escalation, to think about decriminalization, how to deal with a particular situation, to build the trust with that individual, that as a police officer, you're there to help protect them and not arrest them, right? And so that's part, so we're seeing all many, that's just an example, but this idea around transparency and accountability is something that we've been talking about for several years. The mayors of our both cities have been very vocal on this issue, Taha, and they both, when they joined the police board with me, myself and the police board members have been very committed to this issue. And I think core to this issue of transparency, accountability is systemic racism. If you allow me, just for the benefit of your audience, to explain what it is, right? When we talk about systemic racism, we're not saying that individual officers are racist. We're talking about a system that within it exists an influence of bias. Often it's an unconscious bias that impacts or affects the processes and the procedures and the policies of how policing is done. And that ultimately results in over-policing or under-policing of certain communities, right? And so the first step in telling the community that we're working on accountability and transparency and dealing with systemic racism and policing is acknowledgement. The board started to deal with this issue even far before the geopolitical situation, what we were seeing in the US with George Floyd, what we were, the unfortunate incidents in Peel that you commented on, and in early 2019, the chief, on behalf of the board and the police service approached the Ontario Human Rights Commission to say, look, we recognize this exists in policing. We recognize that it exists in Peel Police, and we want to address it and deal with it. So how often the OHRC goes to police services in different cities and they audit or they investigate or they review a certain issue, and then they force binding recommendations on those police services. This is the first time a police services calls the OHRC and says, look, we have a problem. We have an issue that we realize exists. Let's work together on it and agree. And not only agree on what needs to be done to fix it, but we will hold ourselves accountable to you, to the OHRC. And therefore, these recommendations become legally binding. And so, the board and the chief is very committed to this process. And, from early 2019, we signed the agreement in October 2020. That gives you an idea of how complex this issue of systemic racism is and how much work went into building that trust, even with the OHRC, to say, let's do this together, right? Because it's actually unprecedented. It's groundbreaking. And I'll tell you what it's not. It's not a Band-Aid solution to deal with systemic racism. And so this project is fundamentally built on a collaborative effort between the OHRC, Peel Police, our board, and community leaders. We've established an anti-racism committee who will lead this project forward. That's made up of all those stakeholders who will agree on the recommendations and who will oversee the implementation of those recommendations. I sit on that committee. And so, this is a long, complex process. But I'll tell you, Taha, that if we're able to do this here in Peel, it's going to become, inshallah, a framework for ending systemic racism in policing, or any institution for that matter. And I think it'll be something that will be embraced and used to deal with this issue across the country, maybe in other places, any other places around the world, to end systemic racism in institutions.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for shedding light on on this whole sort of police reform model that you guys are working on. And I think, and I'm glad you're sharing this, because community needs to hear this, because I was going to just talk to you about the unfortunate story, of course, of Ijaz Chaudhry last summer. And I wanted to just hear from you, from your perspective, and with the whole idea of police reform that you're working on. How would you have done something differently? So I think you have answered that quite well. The fact that you are collaborating with various entities, and of course, Ontario Human Rights Commission itself is a very credible institution to be working with, and there's that sense of accountability there, and community leaders, and then your board is involved. And yes, inshallah, if you do get it right, then it could be a really a model to be replicated across other boards. So I'm glad to hear that there's some concrete steps being taken, because in the past, what our community has been hearing is, well, yes, we're working on it. Yes, it's a concern. And sometimes, yes, there are Band-Aid solutions as well being offered, but you don't see some concrete policy changing and real reform types of initiatives. So I'm glad you brought this up. Thank you so much. Now, let me go to another sad series of incidents that have occurred not that long ago, as you may be aware, in Edmonton, Alberta, where 6 Muslim girls, mostly essentially of Somali origin, or black young Muslim black girls, have been attacked in the streets and malls by individuals, of course, that are still being investigated, and there have been some arrests, of course. Now, of course, and Peel also has a share of racist attacks at times. We have seen in the past on people who are minorities, racial minorities, or of course religious minorities. My question to you is, all of this, as you know, causes fear and sometimes also mistrust when it involves police itself. So you have fear, of course, in the community of just simply going out and feeling unsafe, being on the street alone, especially late at night, perhaps, and sometimes even during daylight, brazen daylight. But then also that people have this idea and thought that there's not much you're going to get out of reporting, and that trust is also not there. So my question to you is, what steps you would like to take, or like to Peel Region Police to take when it comes to building that trust that you have been talking about, that people feel that if there's a crime in the city, that they can count on our police and our system to go after perpetrators, take action, decisive action, and be there to show that that they care about. They take such issues of Islamophobia or any form of phobia or racism or attacks in general, there again, hate motivated crimes very seriously.
Thank you for that question, Taha. It's a question that's very close to our community, of course. Before I answer that question, if you allow me, you mentioned Brother Ijaz Chaudhry, and I just want to take a moment to speak about that, if you allow me, because,
of course,
in respect to his family, when the incident happened with and Brother Ijaz Chaudhry lost his life, I immediately, with the mayor, we went together and visited the family the same day and expressed our condolences. And then in our next board meeting, we expressed our condolences to the family. And of course, that is only a starting point for the board when we look at that incident and others like it. Of course, I can't comment on the SIU investigation, that's still active, but we think about, why did this happen? How can we make it different? And there's been many discussions around this. Brother Ijaz Chaudhry's case is one that fundamentally is about how we respond to mental health. And, and we as a board recognize that there has been a over-reliance over time around, relying on police to deal with social issues like mental health, like addiction, like housing and homelessness. And so, I just want the community to know, and the family of Brother Ijaz Chaudhry, is that while the chief and SIU and the chief will be dealing with specifics of that case itself, and which is kind of outside of the mandate of the board looks at governance and oversight and strategy and direction. And certainly that incident, among some others, have triggered a conversation on the board that informs where we want to see Peel Police going, so we don't have other cases like Uncle Ijaz Chaudhry when it comes to mental health. And there's a lot of details around what we're doing. There's a lot of action. It's not just talk. There's a lot of action and changes that we're doing. But let me jump to your other question about hate crimes and Islamophobia and what we're seeing in Edmonton, what we've seen, we're seeing it across Canada. I'll tell you, the board receives an annual report every year on increasing hate-motivated crimes and hate-motivated incidents in Peel Region. And there's absolutely no doubt that there is far too many cases that are related to faith-based communities and race communities, and Muslim community and the Jewish community are front and center in the numbers. And that's very scary. People should not ever have to feel fear for their safety because of the faith they choose to practice, or the place of worship they choose to worship in, and or the color of their skin, for that matter. And we, at Peel Police, we're very, the board is very aware of this. And I'll tell you, the chief is very aware of this issue and very committed to addressing this issue and dealing with it very seriously. When we interviewed the chiefs, it was one of the first things that we did as a board. And it's probably one of the most important decisions any police board will ever make. That was a question that I asked to the chief. How will you deal with hate crimes and like Islamophobia? And the chiefs, answered that question really from his heart, because he grew up as a person of color who firsthand experienced hate towards him and his family, and someone who knows what it feels to be a victim of a hate crime or a hate incident, is someone who will always, prioritize and take very seriously when it happens to others, and do whatever it takes to prevent it from happening to others. At Peel Police, Taha, some changes have happened to dealing with the situation. We all know that hate crimes are very connected to the increase we're seeing in far right extremism, right? Yes. And so In Peel Police, the chief has established a countering violent extremism initiative in order to deal with that. And in the police service, they're working with a diverse group of community stakeholders to deliver hate motivated crime training to the police. And not only when they're hired, but there are a number of training modules that police officers have to go through throughout their career to understand what hate motivated crimes are, how we deal with them. A big part of it is not just preventing it, but how you deal with the victims of it. And so there's a lot of work being done to ensure that our police officers have that cultural sensitivity and that cultural and religious awareness around what is a hate motivated crime, but also the empathy and the understanding of what the experience a victim goes through, so that they know how to deal with the situations properly.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing that. I mean, a lot of people, as I mentioned earlier, especially young people, are becoming disillusioned with police and public systems in general. So what advice do you have to those young people, to those youth who are giving up on justice system in general and policing system in particular?
Well, first of all, I think that by joining the board, I think there's been a voice or a response to me joining the board or becoming the chair that stems from the comment you just made about the experiences that members in our community or in general have towards police. And trust me, I'm not disillusioned by the areas that we have to improve on, the areas that we have to fix. But these issues that we're talking about, they're not day-to-day policing issues. These are systemic issues, and so these are long-term systemic change that is required. And as we go through that process, mistakes will be made. But what's important is that we're always working towards that progress, that direction, that we are aware that our communities in Peel are always changing. Their expectations will always be changing, and we need to keep up with that change, and we need to adapt. But we need to keep our eyes on the target, and our board is very clear as to what that target is. And for me, as someone who has 1 year, to serve as chair, and then a total of 4 years to serve on the board, I'm hoping to at least leave knowing that I planted a number of seeds that will eventually grow into something that is meaningful for our community.
Yeah, so definitely, taking a long-term view is important, making sure that we are looking at a bigger picture and trust the individuals, at least, who are doing their best to bring about changes and hopefully we see some positive results, inshallah, over the next few months and years to come. So no, thank you. I think this is part of it, and again, it goes back to the issue of trust as well, which will take some time to rebuild. Now, a couple of questions I wanted to ask you, more related to your personal life and your own leadership over the years. I wanted to ask you, first of all, what motivates you on a day-to-day basis to keep going and keep doing what you do, whether it's in the space of human rights and justice area and social justice area, or any other community development initiatives, or and of course even your work which is public relations, essentially public relations work. So what keeps you going on a daily basis?
So I've chosen a very difficult life for my career in running a crisis management firm, and then being on the Peel Police Board and then other boards that advocate for different issues. But a lot of the things that I work on, Taha, they are very difficult. They're very overwhelming. They do keep me up at night. When you're working on a case of someone who's being held in solitary confinement in some place of the world, and every day is a day of suffering for that person, and and so every day counts. And so you live, this is the type of work that I do, and it's very complex. And there are often times that I feel very vulnerable when I'm not able to do something to help someone else. And so, but what I've learned through positive experiences where, we've been able to change someone's life, is that eventually, with enough work, enough commitment to a cause, eventually doors open. Allies are found on certain issues, and eventually real systemic change begins to show. And the unfortunate weakness of a human being is that we can only see what's happening in front of us in the moment, and we often are not able to think ahead and have enough patience to see this, the outcomes, to wait for the outcomes of the seeds that we plant. And for those who are people who choose lives where they are reformist, or people who commit themselves to social change, and are leaders in those spaces, those people, they understand that the outcomes of our decisions may never be seen even in our own lifetime. And so what is important is that we do our best to make good judgment and always be on the right side of decisions and the roles that we play. And as you know, Taha, as Muslims, we're taught by the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that when a person sees an evil, that their responsibility is to change it first by their hand, and then if not by their mouth, and then if not by their heart in prayer. And so we know that our job is to simply be agents of change, and that's what motivates me. That as long as I know that I'm doing something that is a source of change, an agent of change to something that maybe my children will benefit from, that motivates me to continue to serve and to do that work.
Well, thank you, Ahmad. That's definitely inspiring. Now, you talked about, you sort of alluded to some challenges. I wanted to ask you, if you were to look back, let's say 10 years back, where you were, or even 15 or 20 years ago, and where you are today, were there any challenges that you may want to highlight in your journey to where you are, on your journey to where you are today, that any young person today who wants to, wants to be a change maker like yourself, should be aware of?
I think that we need to, as people who, looking 15 years back, it starts. It actually to be someone who is a person who does something positive for society. What I learned when I realized 10 years back is that I should have started doing things to better myself and becoming stronger at community service, or 20 years back. It starts when you're in high school. It starts by being someone who's responsible and understands that your life is not just about your day-to-day enjoyment. Your life is about serving others, and that's something that my father often taught me and was a role model in doing that. That our lives must be to have purpose, must be to serve humanity. And so when I look back, before I talk about obstacles, it's first about awareness. And the earlier you're aware of the purpose of your life, or how you can make your life more purposeful, the more you become along a path of being someone who does good for others. And with that will always come challenges. I mean, we know anyone who commits his life to doing good will often be challenged with obstacles along the way. And certainly in my life, there were obstacles, and I talked about one, my brother-in-law. That's certainly an obstacle that defined who I was. But I think what's most important in being able to overcome those obstacles is developing that strength and that purpose that keeps you inspired to continue to go down that road.
Awesome. Thank you. That's great. You just talked about, and I'm glad you mentioned your father as a role model, and how fortunate we are if we have parents who are our own parents who are role models. Were there any other mentors or role models in your life that helped you shape your activism and your vision for community work? And it could be anybody, of course, in your life. It could be somebody, it could be a teacher or somebody in the community. And you don't have to necessarily name them if you don't feel like, but I was just curious, were there any mentors that you thought were really helpful in getting you where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I think, certainly everyone we the friends that we choose, the teachers that we learn from, everyone in one way or another is a mentor, is an example. I mean, if we're speaking to youth, it's very important that they choose the right friends. I can think of certainly a number of friends who, it's not an age thing. It's having people around you, and my friends certainly were people around me who were prepared to keep me in check, and encourage me to be someone better. Teachers, I've had teachers, but also community type teachers, leaders in the community who were there to offer advice along the way. And certainly, not so much mentors, Taha, but when I went through my ordeal, and I keep on coming back to it, it certainly is a pivoting moment in my life with my brother-in-law Khalid. In the 3 years that I, essentially shut down my company, and I campaigned with my sister to free him, and we traveled the world, and we met people around the world who do these things all the time. And when I say they do these things, what I'm talking about is they've dedicated their lives to help other people. And we call these people human rights activists, but there are even some people that are just willing to write you a check to help you support your cause, or there are people who are there to help you in your most weakest moment. Here in Canada, in our community, there were, like yourself, including yourself, there were lots of people who stood by myself, my sister, my family, and while I wouldn't necessarily, some of them I would call mentors, other ones I would say their example in their practice and the way they practiced friendship and practice allyship molded my point of view to the world, that that we are responsible to give back, right? And we are responsible to help others in their times of need. And there are many people, Taha, who have influenced that perspective in me, that our lives must be defined around helping others. Only then will one feel a sense of fulfillment when they live their life.
It's amazing. Thank you so much. That's very powerful. Really makes me think as well about the kind of friends we have and how they shape us, and the allies, and that's where we draw so much of our strength from. I just have two questions before we end. I wanted to ask you, at any point, being in this long game that you have been, advocacy in general and human rights work, justice work that you're part of, was there ever a time in your life that you wanted to actually give up? And what did you do?
There's certainly moments where, you need a break. And certainly there are moments where you wonder whether you made the right choices. But I think those moments are tested by one's faith, right? And one's intentions. And your ability to kind of rise up through those moments of weakness are driven by how content you are, how your belief in what you're doing is right, and of course the family support in those moments as well. And so yes, I'm human, and I've had moments where it's been difficult. I remember, I go back to this example because it really, it was really one of my hardest tests, Taha. But with my brother-in-law Khalid, there were moments where you advocate with governments, you advocate with politicians, and you ask people for help, and there are moments where you realize that those people may not be helping, and you think that you're in a moment of weakness because you're dependent or at the mercy of those people. But in those moments, you're then reminded that you're never at the mercy of anyone, that you're only at the mercy of God, and that as long as you fight and as long as you do what's right, that you know, and as we know in our faith, it's God who will then, you know, Allah who will then, you know, has His own plan, and will, you know, bestow His mercy upon you, and open up doors for you, and when you couldn't see the light, then the light appears, right? And so you know, I've had those moments, but it's those moments that really test your heart and your faith and your belief that that you're really, you know, your job to do your job, and the outcomes are not in your hands. The outcomes are up to God. And so you know, that would be my best take at that question.
Well, this is where, of course, the whole idea of trusting in God and tawakkul, and the whole idea of putting your faith in God after doing all your homework really comes into play. And this is what, of course, strengthens people of faith to continue doing what you're doing. So thank you so much for sharing such very personal and, I'm sorry, difficult and courageous moments from your life, and there's so much we could talk to you about in future, inshallah, to learn from and to benefit from. And we wish you, of course, all the best with incredible work that you're doing. I just have one last question as we end, and I will always want to end with some very practical advice, especially for our youth who are wanting to make a change, who want to be change makers like yourself or like others. I wanted to ask you, since you have been in advocacy space and human rights space for so long, what advice would you give to a common young Canadian Muslim or Canadian youth who probably is not aware of why or doesn't understand why advocacy matters? If there are three things that come to your mind that you want to share with us, that, you know, why people should advocate, regardless of what cause it is, any good cause for any oppressed person internationally or locally, any, whether it's Black Lives Movement or Islamophobia or anti-Semitism or anything, and of course indigenous rights and so on, whatever the cause is, why it is that young people need to advocate and really find the courage to actually do the right thing, even if it simply means sending an email to their MP to, you know, get their voices heard, or anything else.
Taha, I'd say, look, just as a background to that question, if we're speaking to the Muslim community, your audience, and Muslim youth, look, you know, in Canada, we have over 1 million Muslims, and at least 30% of those are native born. That tells you that we're second, third generation Muslims. You know, many of us are born here, others immigrate here. But what we all share in common is that we are an active and beautiful community in Canada, and we are contributing to this country. And so what that really means on an individual level is that, number one, it's a responsibility to voice, you know, to use your voice, or to use your hand to write an email, or to, you know, to go stand and you know, in a protest, if that's your way of, you know, speaking out. It's your responsibility to fight for what's right. That's number one reason. Number two, that you know, the idea that someone else will do it is a flawed idea. That if you don't do it, it's not going to get done. And so, you know, you need to hold. There has to be individual accountability for you know, when there is a need for people to act. And then, you know, the third is that a third reason is that as a Muslim, or for any Canadian for that matter, sacrifice and commitment to positive change must always be something that is part of your life. It can mean something different to each one of us, but the idea of doing something good for someone else has to be front and center in the way that one lives his life. And that's, you know, and that for a Muslim, that very much is part of our faith. And so for those reasons, I think individuals, and especially our youth, should feel a sense of responsibility towards lending lending themselves towards these causes, whatever it may be, because there are people around the world who don't have those privileges and don't have those rights and freedoms to do that. And that when they do it, they pay a cost. Here in Canada, you doing it, you don't pay a cost. In fact, it's engraved in our Constitution that you have the right to do it. And so when you ignore that right, you almost do something, you almost do a wrong to someone else who doesn't have that right around the world. And I'll lastly say that, you know, if everybody acknowledged this, or everyone realized this, the collective voice of people together is what actually does change, you know, here in Canada to something better, or around the world. And so the collective voice needs each one of us to step up together.
Awesome. You really did an amazing job of summarizing. And I think that's a reflection of a lot of the work you do yourself. So thank you so much. That was amazing. Jazakumullah khairan. Ahmad, it was a pleasure talking to you, and we look forward to having more conversations. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up here. We're already almost over time here. And so, Ahmad, we wish you all the best with your new endeavors and new roles that you're taking in the areas of policing, justice reforms, the areas of human rights, international human rights, and local efforts that you have. So once again, thank you. And of course, congratulations once again, heartiest congratulations on behalf of our community.
Thank you for having me, Taha.
Take care, Ahmed. Well, that's a wrap, folks. We look forward to having Ahmed again on more interesting and perhaps difficult conversations. And we look forward to having you listen in and giving some ideas, as you have been giving and sharing some ideas for future shows. And once again, I'd like to thank our wonderful production team for putting this show together, from our script writers to technical producers and production team. So once again, thank you for being there. Once again, this is Taha Ghayur on Canada Today, airing on Muslim Network TV. Until next week, signing off. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.